No one remembers her name. No one knows what she did, yet here she stands, accused. By whispers in the marketplace, by rumors of neighbors, she has been marked as a witch. In this town, fear was law and superstition a weapon. A strange mark on the skin, a crop that failed, a neighbor's quarrel, any of it could condemn a woman to the flames. Today, we will uncover her story, a mystery buried in the ashes of history. No one accused of witchcraft ever truly faced a fair trial. In the shadowed corners of 16th and 17th century towns, fear dictated what counted as evidence. Small coincidences, misinterpreted gestures, and even natural phenomena became proof of a woman's guilt. Today, we step into these courts, into the minds of villagers who lived in constant anxiety, and examine the clues that condemned women to the flames. The first type of evidence was the most tangible, or so they believed, the body itself. Inspectors looked for what they called a witch's mark, sometimes referred to as a witch's teat. According to court records from Trier in 1589, women were stripped and searched for unusual blemishes, moles, or raised skin patches. These marks, believed to be where a familiar, a demon in animal form, sucked blood, were cited as undeniable proof of allegiance to Satan. One court transcript recounts a woman whose only visible mark was a small birthmark on her arm, yet the inquisitors recorded it meticulously, stating it could only have been placed by the devil. Strange bodily marks were not the only supposed signs. Villagers scrutinized behavior, interpreting any deviation from the norm as proof of witchcraft. Consider the town of Würzburg, Germany, where in 1629, a woman named Ursula was accused of bewitching livestock. Court notes describe how her goats fell ill after she spoke harshly to them. This simple observation, a farmer noting a sick goat after a quarrel, was interpreted as evidence of a curse. Fear amplified these connections. To the townspeople, coincidences were proof. Normal misfortune was the work of witches. Words, too, could condemn. Overheard murmurs or casual comments were twisted into confessions of evil intent. In Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, the court transcript of Mary Walcott notes that she accused a neighbor after interpreting a vague statement as a threat. Even laughter in public, whispers in church, or an ill-timed remark could be construed as an incantation or curse. Historians today emphasize that villagers did not act out of cruelty alone. They acted from genuine terror. Superstition was a lens through which they understood an unpredictable world, and any anomaly could be a mark of the devil. Objects and personal items were also scrutinized. Pins, needles, or everyday household objects could become instruments of magic. One German case records a woman accused after her neighbor's child fell ill. The accuser claims the child had been pricked by a hidden pin placed by the woman in a doll, a common folkloric practice thought to be witchcraft. The court accepted this as sufficient evidence. In reality, the child's illness was likely natural, yet fear and interpretation of superstition overruled reason. These everyday items, mundane in their context, were transformed into instruments of horror. The very act of accusation was often manipulated. Some villagers turned private grievances into public trials, using the court as a weapon. A woman might be accused because she refused to lend money, because her crops outperformed a neighbor's, or because she simply lived alone. In Trier, 1589, court records reveal that accusations often stemmed from petty disputes, an argument over land boundaries, a quarrel about children, or a disagreement over livestock grazing rights. Yet in the context of fear, each dispute became evidence of malevolent intent. Fear of the supernatural played a crucial role. In Salem, a small community gripped by anxiety and religious zeal, spectral evidence was admissible. Witnesses claimed to see apparitions of the accused torturing them or harming livestock. In one case, a woman named Sarah Good was accused after two young girls reported seeing her spirit afflict them in a vision. court notes meticulously recorded these visions as evidence. To modern eyes, such testimony seems absurd, yet at the time, spectral evidence reflected a society that believed the spiritual and physical worlds were deeply intertwined. What could not be seen with the eyes could be felt with the heart, and that was enough to condemn a life. The context of these trials was never neutral. Fear was communal. Rumors spread quickly through towns where neighbors lived in close quarters, reliant on each other yet suspicious of each other. Archivists studying the Würzburg trials note that accusations often began as whispers and snowballed. A neighbor's casual statement about a failed crop could become the seed for months of investigation. Fear acted as both evidence and amplifier, transforming mundane observations into capital charges. In Trier, 1589, a woman named Agatha faced interrogation because her neighbor's cow died unexpectedly. Court records describe how inquisitors asked a series of leading questions, each designed to confirm guilt. Did you speak to the cow before it fell ill? Did you touch it in anger? Do you know a charm that could harm the animal? Agatha, like many, answered truthfully to neutral questions, unaware that her words were being twisted into proof of witchcraft. Fear made witnesses see patterns where none existed. Judges and juries, themselves convinced of supernatural threats, accepted these patterns as irrefutable. Even children became tools of accusation. In Salem, a small community gripped by anxiety and religious zeal, young girls were often the primary witnesses, reporting visions of specters or claiming to feel supernatural pain inflicted by the accused. Historical records show that their testimonies were taken seriously by the courts. In some cases, these accusations stemmed from childish mischief, attention-seeking, or the influence of adults. Yet in the atmosphere of fear, their words carried the weight of divine truth. The absurdity of the accusations extended to the natural world. Illness, droughts, or crop failure were frequently interpreted as the result of witchcraft. Villagers often connected these events to women who were socially vulnerable, widows, midwives, or those who lived alone. Court documents repeatedly reference unexplained misfortunes as evidence. In one trial, a woman was accused simply because a storm destroyed her neighbor's barn. The rational connection between human action and natural events was irrelevant. Superstition filled the void of understanding. Witch hunts also relied heavily on the idea of confessions, but even the presence of marks or proofs could provoke self-incrimination. Historical accounts note that women were often convinced to admit guilt, believing that denial would result in harsher punishment. In Trier, a woman named Katerina confessed under duress to having made a pact with the devil, even though no one could produce a shred of physical evidence beyond her alleged mark. Her confession became the centerpiece of the trial. Here, fear and manipulation reinforced the interpretation of every trivial detail as damning. Trials in Europe and America share a pattern. The evidence was circumstantial, absurd by modern standards, yet treated as incontrovertible. In Würzburg, women were accused of using a simple broomstick to fly to secret gatherings. Court transcripts describe detailed questioning about the mechanics of flight and the identities of other witches allegedly present. In Salem, spectral visions served the same function, creating a network of guilt and fear that was impossible to contest. The documentation from these trials is chilling not just for what it reveals about superstition, but for what it shows about human psychology. Fear, social pressure, and religious zeal created an environment where ordinary coincidences were magnified into crimes punishable by death. Every sneeze, every tripping child, every failed harvest became a piece of a larger puzzle, one that always ended with the accused on the pyre. In Trier, Würzburg, and Salem alike, the courts became detectives, but not in a rational sense. They pieced together clues from dreams, bodily marks, gossip, and misfortune, constructing a narrative of guilt from fragments of coincidence. Villagers and judges alike believed in the reality of the supernatural. To question it was to invite danger, for disbelief could be interpreted as complicity. Fear created its own logic, and within it, the accused had no chance of escape. Even mundane actions carried weight. A woman seen carrying herbs, performing traditional remedies, or assisting a neighbor could be interpreted as practicing dark magic. Midwives were particularly vulnerable, for they had knowledge of bodies, medicine, and birth, a combination easily framed as unnatural or dangerous. Court documents from Würzburg list midwives as disproportionately accused, their skills twisted into evidence of malevolent intent. By examining these clues, we understand that witch trials were less about crime and more about context. Every mark, every word, every coincidence mattered because fear dictated meaning. Historical records show that societies under pressure, whether from famine, disease, or social instability, were especially prone to interpreting anomalies as the work of witches. Evidence was not just physical, it was cultural, psychological, and communal. The absurdity of the accusations does not diminish the horror that followed. Each case represents a life upended, a family torn apart, and a society consumed by fear. In Trier, a woman's confession that she had danced with the devil led to the execution of dozens. In Salem, In the shadow of the trials, the accused were never alone. Behind every accusation stood a web of personal motives: jealousy, resentment, or ambition. Court records across Europe reveal a troubling pattern. Women who lived independently, who challenged social norms, or who had inherited property were often the first targets. In 1645 England, Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witch-Finder General, traveled from town to town, exploiting fear for both social authority and personal gain. His court records show that accusations frequently arose from disputes over property or petty quarrels between neighbors. One transcript notes a widow accused after her land was coveted by a wealthier neighbor. The accusation was framed as evidence of witchcraft, yet underlying it was a simple human desire: control. Jealousy was another driving force. In Würzburg, Germany, a woman named Anna was accused after another woman claimed her crops had mysteriously failed. The court documents record the accuser's insistence that Anna had cursed the land. Historical letters suggest the accuser may have envied Anna's thriving farmstead. Social tension became legal proof. Resentment became a crime punishable by death. Accusations also reinforced existing hierarchies. Widows, healers, and women who deviated from expected roles were particularly vulnerable. In Trier, records show that women who spoke out in town meetings or refused traditional marriage proposals were singled out. Their independence was interpreted as defiance against the social order, and in a society where conformity was equated with morality, this defiance was evidence of witchcraft. The testimony of accusers often reveals the complexity of human interaction. In Salem, Massachusetts, young girls, often between 9 and 12, testified against neighbors, claiming spectral visions or supernatural attacks. Court records show that these girls were influenced by family members, neighbors, and the pervasive fear in the community. Their words carried enormous weight, demonstrating how social pressure and personal dynamics could turn perception into legal reality. In some cases, accusers had a clear interest in the downfall of the accused. Letters from the Würzburg trials indicate that several accusations were motivated by economic gain. If a woman's property could be confiscated or if her removal would elevate another family's standing, courts often accepted these accusations without question. The law, intertwined with superstition, became a tool for personal ambition. Judges themselves sometimes contributed to this dynamic. Matthew Hopkins, for instance, established his reputation through aggressive pursuit of alleged witches. Court records describe him instructing witnesses, guiding testimonies, and interpreting ambiguous evidence in ways that reinforced his authority. Social order, fear, and personal ambition intersected, creating a cycle where the accused had little chance of survival. patterns emerge across continents and decades. Marginalized women, widows, healers, and those who resisted conformity were disproportionately accused. Ordinary disputes over land, children, or livestock transformed into deadly allegations. Fear, social jealousy, and the desire for power fueled accusations that seemed to emerge from nowhere but were rooted deeply in human behavior. The perspective of the accused tells a parallel story. Diaries, letters, and court testimonies show women struggling to survive not just the trial, but the social isolation that preceded it. One woman from Trier wrote of her despair, noting that neighbors she had known for years suddenly avoided her, whispered behind her back, and eyed her children with suspicion. In Salem, women testified that even those who had once been friends turned accuser, influenced by fear or pressure from authorities. The accuser's game was not just legal, it was social, psychological, and inescapable. By alternating between the accuser's documented motives and the experience of the accused, a picture emerges of a society consumed by fear and human frailty. Superstition provided the framework, but human motives provided the spark. Each accusation carried the weight of both personal grievances and collective anxiety, a deadly combination that left the accused with little hope of justice. Even in hindsight, the patterns are clear. Accusations often arose from conflict, envy, or ambition and targeted those least able to defend themselves. Marginalized women bore the brunt, and the legal system, designed to investigate truth, became a weapon of social control. Fear, human desire, and institutional authority converged, creating a system where accusation itself was enough to condemn. The accuser's game was complex and dangerous, blending personal motives with societal pressures. Historical records reveal not just the fear of witches, but the fear of women who refused to fit into a rigid social order. In the end, it was not evidence alone that condemned the accused, it was the interplay of human ambition, suspicion, and the power of fear. Confession was considered the ultimate proof of guilt in the witch trials, yet what these confessions revealed was not truth, but the immense power of fear. Across Europe and colonial America, accused women rarely confessed of their own free will. Their words were shaped, guided, and often forced by the machinery of interrogation. Sleep deprivation, isolation, threats, and leading questions were common tools designed to break their resistance. Through these methods, even the innocent were compelled to admit crimes they had not committed, sometimes implicating friends, neighbors, and family members in the process. In Trier, Germany, 1589, court records describe a woman held in custody for weeks without proper sleep. Interrogators returned repeatedly, posing the same questions about pacts with the devil, supposed curses, and the identities of other witches. Exhausted, she struggled to maintain her denials. Historical scholars note that fatigue alone reduced her ability to reason and resist, making her susceptible to suggestion. Every pause or hesitation in her answers was interpreted as a sign of guilt. The records meticulously detail each session, noting her confusion, exhaustion, and eventual submission. Isolation was another powerful instrument. In Salem, Massachusetts, letters and court documents indicate that women accused of witchcraft were often confined in solitary rooms, separated from family and support networks. Social bonds that might have provided comfort or counsel were deliberately cut off. In this state of loneliness and fear, the interrogator's words took on greater weight. Threats of execution, insinuations about the suffering of others, and repeated questioning created psychological pressure that often led to confession. One court record from Salem notes that an accused woman, after several days of isolation and repeated questioning, finally acknowledged the devil's influence over her actions, though she had previously denied any wrongdoing. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and threats were often combined with leading questions designed to guide the accused toward predetermined confessions. In the Pendle witch trials of 1612, court transcripts reveal that interrogators asked precise questions. Did you attend the devil's meeting on the hill? Have you used charms to harm your neighbors? Who among the villagers joined you? Each question assumed guilt, and the accused were pressed to answer. Compliance was framed as a way to lessen their suffering, while resistance only prolonged it. Scholars examining these transcripts note the pattern. Interrogators controlled both the narrative and the pacing of confession, effectively scripting the statements of the accused. Threats of violence or execution were also a constant presence. In Trier, court records from 1589 recount that an accused woman was warned that refusal to confess would result in torture or immediate execution. The tone of the interrogators, though sometimes recorded as calm, carried implicit menace. One transcript reads, "The woman was told that silence or denial would be met with the devil's wrath and the court's justice." This combination of fear, both supernatural and legal, pressured women into compliance. Confession became not a moral choice, but a survival strategy. The structure of confessions reveals much about the coercive process. Typically, they began with acknowledgement of a pact with the devil, described acts of maleficence, and often concluded with the naming of accomplices. In Salem, one woman's confession, preserved in court records, details visions of her spirit harming neighbors, followed by the names of 3 fellow villagers. Similarly, in Pendle, confessions documented by the court describe supernatural gatherings, flights on broomsticks, and the use of charms to inflict illness or misfortune. Historians analyzing these documents emphasize that these statements followed the formula expected by authorities, rather than any independent recollection of actual events. The confessions were a product of interrogation methods and societal expectations, not personal guilt. Accused women were often compelled to implicate others, a tactic that amplified fear and suspicion throughout the community. In Trier, once a woman admitted to minor acts of witchcraft, she was prompted to provide the names of co-conspirators. Failure to do so could result in further isolation, intensified questioning, or the threat of execution. This method created a cascading effect. One confession generated others, and soon entire communities were entangled in webs of accusation. The social consequences were devastating. Families were divided, friendships destroyed, and mistrust spread like wildfire. Court documents from both Europe and colonial America demonstrate that this mechanism of forced naming was central to sustaining the witch trials over months and even years. The psychological mechanics behind these confessions were sophisticated. Interrogators relied on a combination of direct pressure, social isolation, and manipulation of hope and fear. By offering the possibility of leniency in exchange for cooperation, they created an environment where confession was the only path to survival. Court records often reflect the exact wording used. If you confess, mercy may be shown. If you resist, you will face the full rigor of justice. The accused were presented with a binary choice that always favored the court's narrative. Resistance was interpreted as guilt, compliance became a form of coerced testimony. Spectral evidence further complicated the process. In Salem, accusations often included claims that the accused spirit had been seen tormenting neighbors. Confession under these circumstances was particularly complex. The accused had to admit to acts that were intangible, based on visions and perceptions rather than observable actions. Historical accounts show that women sometimes confirmed these accusations, not because they believed them, but because repeated questioning and community pressure made denial futile. The courts treated these statements as factual, despite their basis in fear and imagination. Even the phrasing of confessions was controlled. Transcripts from Pendle reveal that interrogators dictated specific language, guiding the accused to describe encounters with the devil, gatherings of witches, and magical practices. One record notes that a woman's initial hesitation was corrected by the interrogator. Describe what happened at the meeting as others have told you. The accused were aware that their words would be scrutinized and interpreted literally, creating further incentive to comply. Over time, this led to confessions that were internally consistent and aligned with the expectations of the court, yet entirely constructed under duress. Children also played a role in the production of confessions. In Salem, young witnesses often reported visions of the accused harming them through invisible means. Court records indicate that their testimony was incorporated into interrogations, with accused women pressured to validate these visions. Letters from the period show that women feared not only the court, but the reactions of neighbors and family members who had been influenced by these reports. The confessions thus became collaborative documents, combining coerced statements from the accused with community testimony and spectral claims. The consequences of these confessions were immediate and irreversible. Once documented, they were used to justify executions and further accusations. In Pendle, a single coerced confession led to the trial and execution of several women named within it. In Salem, confessions prompted new investigations, expanding the hysteria to additional households. Historical analysis reveals that the confessions functioned as both evidence and mechanism of social control, reinforcing fear while providing the courts with the appearance of legitimacy. Understanding these confessions also requires examining the broader social and cultural pressures at play. Women accused of witchcraft were often marginalized: widows, healers, women living alone, or those who defied community norms. Historians note that the combination of social vulnerability and intensive interrogation created an environment in which confession was inevitable. Survival rather than truth dictated the content of their statements. Court records preserved these statements as evidence, effectively turning coercion into historical testimony. Even centuries later, these confessions offer chilling insight. They reveal how authority, fear, and psychological pressure can shape statements to fit predetermined narratives. Innocent individuals were compelled to narrate their own guilt, creating a historical record that simultaneously documents coercion and erases actual innocence. By studying these documents, we understand both the mechanics of manipulation and the human cost of systemic fear. The trap of confession demonstrates that witch trials were not legal investigations in the modern sense. They were structured, deliberate processes designed to generate compliance and reinforce collective anxiety. Accused women were never simply defendants. They were instruments in a system that relied on fear, coercion, and social pressure to function. Their confessions, extracted under duress, became tools for the continuation of hysteria, ensuring that suspicion, accusation, and execution could spread through towns, villages, and colonies. Even the content of confessions reflects the extraordinary control of interrogators. The consistent patterns, pacts with the devil, supernatural acts, and naming of accomplices show that confessions were shaped more by expectation than reality. These statements were recorded meticulously, often with comments on the demeanor and expressions of the accused, as though every gesture reinforced guilt. Sleep deprivation, The final days of those accused of witchcraft were a study in human fear and cruelty. Across Europe and colonial America, imprisonment, public shaming, and execution were the inevitable conclusion for many women caught in the machinery of accusation. Court records, diaries, and local accounts reveal not only the procedures of their deaths, but the complex reactions of the communities around them. Fear, guilt, relief, and suspicion all intertwined in the moments that led to the pyre, the gallows, or the prison cell. Imprisonment was often the first stage of the final ordeal. In Trier, 1589, archival records describe women held in damp, overcrowded cells, their movements restricted for days or weeks while awaiting trial and execution. Conditions were harsh: minimal food, little water, and limited warmth. Historical letters suggest that the constant anxiety and physical discomfort were part of the process. Authorities knew that prolonged confinement eroded the will of the accused, making confession and compliance more likely. Diaries from the period describe women pacing their cells, whispering prayers, and attempting to maintain composure, all while hearing the murmurs of other prisoners, some of whom would soon face the flames. Public shaming accompanied imprisonment and trial. Town squares, churches, and marketplaces became stages for the display of accused women. In Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, records show women brought before crowds, sometimes in chains, required to publicly confess or stand silently while accusations were read aloud. This exposure reinforced the narrative of guilt and allowed the community to witness and participate in the enforcement of social and religious order. Eyewitness accounts from Salem describe the mixture of horror and fascination in the townspeople. Some watched silently, some expressed relief that evil was being punished, and others were unsettled by the knowledge that neighbors could be accused next. Execution, when it came, was meticulously recorded in local chronicles and diaries. In Pendle, England, 1612, 10 women were hanged after trial. Contemporary accounts describe the procession from the prison to the gallows. The condemned women were often stoic, though some fainted or sobbed. Eyewitness reports note that the townspeople watched in silence, punctuated by murmurs of prayer or occasional sobs from relatives. In Trier, 1589, executions at the pyre were similarly documented. Flames consumed the bodies of the condemned, while townspeople, some fearful, some eager, observed from a distance. Chroniclers emphasized the finality and public nature of punishment, but also the tension it generated in communities already steeped in fear. The emotions documented in these accounts were varied. Fear was pervasive. Townspeople lived in terror that they too could be accused. Some expressed relief, believing that the removal of a supposed witch restored safety to the community. In Würzburg, letters describe neighbors openly rejoicing that the alleged source of misfortune had been eliminated. Yet there was also guilt. Diaries reveal families mourning quietly, aware that the woman condemned may have been innocent or that social pressures had forced false accusations. Indifference was another reaction. Some watched out of curiosity, detached from the moral implications, treating executions as spectacles rather than acts of justice or cruelty. Lesser-known cases offer insight into the human complexity of these events. In a small village in Lorraine, France, archival records recount the execution of Jeanne d'Arc, not the famous saint, but a local woman accused of using charms to harm livestock. She was led to the pyre while villagers looked on. Letters from the period describe a mix of emotions. Children cried, neighbors whispered prayers, and some muttered skepticism about her guilt. These fragments, preserved in municipal records, illustrate how ordinary communities experienced the execution of those accused, simultaneously fearful, morally conflicted, and compelled by social norms. The condemned women themselves faced terror, exhaustion, and resignation. Diaries and letters, where they survive, reveal attempts at maintaining dignity and faith. One woman in Salem wrote of praying constantly, preparing herself for death, while simultaneously noting the bewildering reality that friends and neighbors had turned against her. In Trier, a woman awaiting execution reportedly spent her final days observing the routines of guards and other prisoners, noting the subtle expressions of sympathy or contempt from the townspeople. These perspectives remind us that the condemned were not passive victims. They were aware, emotionally engaged, and attempting to navigate a world that had declared them guilty. Communities also experienced lasting consequences. The execution of an accused woman did not always restore calm. In Würzburg, the death of one woman led to renewed accusations against her relatives as the pattern of suspicion shifted outward. In Salem, letters and town records indicate that fear persisted long after executions, with new accusations emerging months later. Historical analysis suggests that executions both reinforced social control and perpetuated cycles of hysteria. Fear was never fully eradicated. It simply moved from one target to the next, leaving communities tense and fragmented. In some instances, executions sparked debate and reflection. Chronicles from Trier note that certain clergy questioned whether the accused were truly guilty, but their objections were often dismissed or silenced. Similarly, in Salem, some ministers expressed concern that the reliance on spectral evidence and coerced confessions had led to injustice. These historical records remind us that not all contemporaries were comfortable with the procedures, though the structures of fear and authority made challenge difficult and dangerous. Eyewitness accounts highlight the sensory reality of executions. The smell of smoke at pyres, the sight of bodies hanging from gallows, and the murmurs of the crowd were all meticulously recorded by local chroniclers. These details provide vivid context for the psychological atmosphere: horror interlaced with ritualized order, fear mingled with communal validation of moral and religious authority. The physical presence of punishment reinforced the ideological message of the trials. Deviation from social or religious norms would be met with the harshest consequences. The aftermath for families of the condemned was complex and often painful. Property could be seized, reputations tarnished, and social relations strained. Diaries and letters describe relatives struggling with grief, shame, and fear of association. In some cases, surviving family members were ostracized or further accused, highlighting the intergenerational impact of witch trials. Communities, while briefly reassured, remained unstable, with lingering suspicion and tension. Historical records also emphasize the randomness and arbitrariness of targeting. In smaller villages, accusations could arise from envy over a garden, jealousy of a neighbor's children, or resentment over minor disputes. These trivial origins, amplified by fear, resulted in irreversible consequences. Execution and public shaming served as both punishment and warning, reinforcing communal norms, but the true victims were often innocent women whose only transgression was existing in a society predisposed to suspicion. The emotional contrast between the condemned and the community is striking. For the women, fear, confusion, and resignation dominated their final days. For the townspeople, reactions varied. Some felt justice had been served, others were haunted by doubts, and still others participated with a detached curiosity. Letters from Trier and Salem emphasize that this mixture of emotions created tension in the very moment of execution, a dynamic preserved in historical records for centuries. Public executions were also performative, designed to assert authority. In both Europe and colonial America, the visibility of punishment reinforced social hierarchies. Execution was not simply a legal act, it was a public spectacle that reminded communities of the dangers of deviation and the necessity of conformity. Chroniclers often noted the meticulous preparation of pyres, the positioning of accused women, and the behavior expected of the crowd, underscoring the theatrical as well as punitive nature of the events. In some cases, executions were followed by official reflection or inquiry. In Würzburg, municipal records indicate post-trial reviews, noting the number of accused, the procedures followed, and occasionally expressions of concern regarding the accuracy of accusations. In Salem, town meetings after executions attempted to reconcile communal anxiety with moral conscience, debating the fairness of relying on spectral evidence and coerced confessions. These records suggest that while executions satisfied immediate social pressures, they did not resolve the underlying fear or mistrust within communities. The finality of death contrasted with the ongoing social consequences. Executed women were physically removed, but suspicion remained alive. Family members could be accused, neighbors eyed each other warily, and superstition persisted. Diaries from the period recount lingering rumors of witchcraft even after multiple executions in a single town. In this way, death did not fully end the influence of the accused. It became part of a larger narrative of fear, control, and social order. Even lesser-known cases offer insight into the human complexity of these events. In a small village in Lorraine, France, archival records recount the execution of Jeanne d'Arc, not the famous saint, but a local woman accused of using charms to harm livestock. She was led to the pyre while villagers looked on. Letters from the period describe a mix of emotions. Children cried, neighbors whispered prayers, and some muttered skepticism about her guilt. These fragments, preserved in municipal records, illustrate how ordinary communities experienced the execution of those accused, simultaneously fearful, morally conflicted, and compelled by social norms. Death and aftermath also illustrate the efficiency of fear as a tool of control. Communities internalized the consequences of deviation, learning to self-police and enforce social norms without direct intervention. Historical accounts emphasize that the public nature of executions served as both punishment.
Even centuries later, the witch trials leave us with questions that cannot be fully answered. Many names have been lost to history, women whose lives were extinguished without record, whose stories vanished into the ashes of pyres and forgotten cells. In Trier, Würzburg, and Salem, we know the mechanisms of accusation, confession, and execution, but we cannot know the full truth of individual experiences. Letters and court records give us fragments, a mention of a widow accused, a transcript of coerced testimony, a ledger noting a confiscated home. Beyond these fragments, their lives are obscured, leaving us with gaps historians can only speculate about. Historians continue to debate the underlying forces behind the witch hunts. Some argue that fear of women, especially those who challenged social norms or lived independently, fueled the trials. Widows, midwives, and healers were disproportionately accused, their knowledge and independence threatening a patriarchal order. Others emphasize political, economic, and social instability. Wars, plagues, and famines created anxiety, and authorities may have leveraged accusations to maintain control or distract from broader crises. Letters and contemporary commentaries reflect this tension. Clergy worried about the moral health of towns, municipal leaders documented property disputes, and neighbors expressed a mixture of fear and resignation. Motives often remain unresolved. Why did a particular accusation emerge in one village but not another? Why did some women survive while others perished for similar crimes? Court records provide procedural detail but rarely illuminate personal intent or private emotion. Even with extensive archival research, some questions cannot be answered. The reasoning behind certain accusations, the truth of coerced confessions, or the internal thoughts of women standing before judges, all remain partially unknowable. These unresolved questions are amplified by the selective preservation of history. Official documents recorded legal outcomes, but rarely captured the voices of ordinary witnesses, families, or the condemned. Diaries and letters offer glimpses, but survival was inconsistent. For every recorded confession or testimony, countless others vanished, leaving gaps that historians must navigate with care. The absence of names, the silencing of voices, and the destruction of records remind us that history is incomplete, shaped as much by what was preserved as by what was lost. Yet, even in this uncertainty, patterns emerge. Archival evidence consistently shows that women bore the brunt of accusation, that social tensions and fear played decisive roles, and that legal systems operated within frameworks that amplified suspicion and coercion. Scholars analyzing Salem, Trier, and Würzburg highlight parallels across continents and centuries. Hysteria spreads fastest when communities are anxious, marginalized individuals are most vulnerable, and authority is unchecked. These recurring dynamics, observed across diverse cases, suggest that witch trials were not isolated anomalies, but reflections of broader human and societal vulnerabilities. Primary sources reveal how communities struggled to interpret tragedy. Letters from Trier record townspeople attempting to justify executions, some expressing relief that the evil was removed, others privately questioning the morality of the actions. In Salem, surviving correspondence shows citizens wrestling with guilt and uncertainty long after the flames were extinguished. These documents offer a window into the moral ambiguity of collective action. Fear, obedience, and superstition intersected in ways that allowed injustice to flourish, while leaving survivors and witnesses morally and emotionally unsettled. The witch trials also challenge our understanding of memory and justice. How do we remember those who were silenced? How do we weigh evidence that was itself coerced or fabricated under extreme social pressure? Archival research allows us to reconstruct events, but it cannot fully recover lost lives or motivations. Through examining surviving records, historians invite reflection on the fragility of human judgment and the consequences of societal fear. Letters, court notes, and diaries act as partial witnesses, hinting at truths we may never fully grasp. Even today, these events resonate as warnings. The selective preservation of history, the fragility of evidence, and the power of fear all remind us that justice depends on vigilance, reason, and compassion. The witch trials illustrate the dangers of allowing hysteria, prejudice, and social pressure to dictate outcomes. Historians continue to study these cases not just to understand the past, but to reflect on human behavior, societal fears, and the mechanisms that allow injustice to persist. some truths remain buried in the ashes of the witch trials. We may never know the names, thoughts, or final words of countless women who stood accused. We may never fully understand why certain accusations arose or why particular individuals were spared. What we do know, however, is preserved in records, letters, and trials, the mechanisms of fear, the pressures of social dynamics, and the human cost of suspicion. These fragments challenge us to confront questions of memory, justice, and morality. As we reflect, we are left with haunting questions. How do societies choose who is guilty and who is innocent? How much does fear shape reality? How are the voices of the vulnerable amplified or silenced by authority? The witch trials do not offer easy answers, but they demand contemplation. They remind us that history is never complete, that some truths are irretrievable, and that injustice often thrives where fear and uncertainty prevail. In the end, we are left to listen to the fragments, to reconstruct the past from surviving documents, and to remember that each lost name, each coerced confession, and each execution represents a life erased. Some truths remain buried in the ashes of the witch trials, yet through careful study, reflection, and remembrance, we keep the memory of the accused alive, and perhaps, in doing so, learn to confront the fears that still shape human communities today.